Gets back there, and now back to the book. We left Pavuvu, victors of Guadalcanal and New Britain. We went out to fight again, marching into the open-jawed landing craft driven up on the beach. Never before were we so confident of victory. Never again would its price be so high. Peleliu was already a holocaust. The island, flat and almost featureless, was an altar being prepared for the immolation of 17,000 men. So they're going on to Peleliu, and here we go, right into it. They're in their landing craft. The water began to erupt and little geysers in the air became populated with exploding steel. The enemy was saluting us. They were receiving us with mortar and artillery fire. 10,000 Japanese awaited on the island of Peleliu. 10,000 men as brave and determined and skillful as ever a garrison was since the art of warfare began. Skillful, yes, it was a terrible rain, and it did terrible work among us before we reached the beach. Our Amtrak was among the first assault waves, yet the beach was already a litter of burning, blackened amphibian tractors, of dead and wounded, a mortar garden of exploding mortar shells. Holes had beer scooped in the white sand, or had been blasted out by the shells. The beach was pocked with holes, all filled with green-clad, helmeted Marines. We were pinned down. We were pinned down, but not by mortars alone. Machine gun fire came from an invincible outpost which the Japanese had blasted out of a coral jutting into the bay. We found an opening in it, and even then were filling it with all manners of small arms fire, grenades, sticks of dynamite hurled by men who had crept up to it, or billowing fire from the flamethrowers who had also gained the hole. But the answering fire continued to rake our deadly picnic ground. And the reason for that is here, for the Japanese had possessed Peleliu for 2 decades and had blasted into the coral a network of mutually supporting caves. They'd been there for 20 years preparing for this. And so they've got this massive cave network, and even every time they hit one of these locations, the more guys would just pop up. And the Japanese also had tanks on Peleliu. Back to the book. Their tanks swooped in suddenly upon us. They came tearing across the airfield, a dozen or so of them. It was startling. They'd come out of nowhere, and here were only riflemen and machine gunners to oppose them. There was a violent outburst of gunfire. I poked my head above the crater. Through the lacy branchwork of the scrub trees, I saw an enemy tank streaking along with snipers in camouflage hanging onto the rear. It was but a moment's glance, but at the time, my eye caught sight of a Marine from F Company, a veteran, running bow-legged to the rear, his face writhing, shouting, "Tanks, tanks!" An officer grabbed him and spun him around and kicked him and propelled him back to his post. In the crater, we'd prepared for defense like a caravan attacked by Indians. The enemy tanks whizzed past, their little wheels whirling within the tracks. Machine guns clattered, bazookas whammed. Our airplanes came screeching down from heaven. And there rose the detonation of their bombs and the roar of exploding tanks. To my right, I saw a line of our tanks advancing, firing as they came, seeming to stop each time their guns stuttered. Then it was over. The Jap tanks had been destroyed. I turned to go, and as I did, nearly stepped on someone's hand. "Excuse me," I began to say, but then I saw that it was an unattached hand, or rather a detached one. It lay there alone, open, palm upwards, clean, capable, solitary. I could not tear my eyes from it. The hand is the artisan of the soul. It is the second member of the human trinity, of head and hand and heart. A man has no faculty more human than his hand, none more beautiful, nor expressive, nor productive. to see this hand lying alone, as though contemptuously cast aside, no longer a part of man, no longer his help, was to see war in all its wantonness. It was to see the especially brutal savagery of our own technique of rending. And it was to see men at their eternal worst, turning upon one another, tearing one another, clawing at their own innards with the maniacal fury of the pride possessed. Not much I can comment on that one. Back to the book. Our casualties were extremely heavy. Before the day was done, they would total 500 in the 1st Regiment, something like 20%. This on the first day. We were advancing again. Our objective was Bloody Nose Ridge. This was the high ground visible from across the airfield. It gave the enemy perfect observation. Advancing across the flat table of crushed coral, on which there was hardly a single depression, as we were easily sighted as clay ducks in a shooting gallery. But there was no other route, and we had to take it. Grass-cutting machine gun fire swept the airfield. Mortar shells fell with the calm regularity of automation. Marines fell. They crumpled. They staggered. They pitched forward. They sank to their knees. They fell backwards. They kept advancing. The mortars had stopped. The 1st F Company wave was advancing across the airstrip, running low, with ranks scattered, breasting a withering machine gun fire that had begun to rake the runway. They were falling. It seemed unreal. It seemed a tableau, like a scene from a motion picture. It required an effort of mind to recall that these were flesh and blood Marines, men whom I knew, whose lives were linked with mine. Still more was required in facing up to the fact that my turn was next. And here is the point in battle where one needs the rallying cry. Here where the banner must be unfurled, or the song sung, or the name of the cause flung at the enemy like a challenge. Here is the mounted charge. The thing as old as warfare itself, that either overwhelms the defense and wins the battle, or is broken and brings on defeat. How much less forbidding might have been that avenue of death that I was about to cross had there been some wholly irrational shout, like "Vive l'Empereur" or "The Marine Corps forever," rather than that educated voice, which in a sang-froid that was at all odds with the event, said, "Well, it's our turn now." That's all you're going to get. That's all you're going to get. These Marines are getting tore apart by machine gun fire, by mortar. They're getting tore apart. Marines are falling left and right. They're continuing to advance. They're continuing to advance. And he's watching this group go across this airfield, getting mowed down. He wants some kind of motivation. And what does he get? Well, it's our turn now. Crazy. I bade goodbye to the artist. He looked at me sadly from beneath his helmet, his face made darker and more angular by its shadow. He cast a rueful glance in the direction of the airstrip and the still falling men. "Good luck, kid," he said, and turned away. I began to run. The heat rose in stifling waves. The bullet whispered at times. At other times they were not audible. I ran with my head low, my helmet bumping crazily to obscure my view, like waves rising around a small ship. In a moment, I could not see Lieutenant Deep Chest or Filthy Fred. I was alone and running. There were men to my left. still falling. I ran and threw myself down, caught my breath, rose again, and ran again. Suddenly I ran into a shell crater full of men, and I stopped running. So the only cover that they have is a shell crater. And he dives into this shell crater, and there's 10 guys or so in there. And one of them, he's calling this one guy walkie-talkie. Back to the book. Walkie-talkie sat below me on the crater floor. He hunched his shoulders toward me and asked me to twirl certain dials. I did, but he could not seem to get through. There came the screech of a shell. I braced my back for it, even though I knew that the ones you hear are not the ones to be feared. But how fear the one that gets you? The one you do not hear. Another voice was audible now. The 5th Marines lieutenant, who was wounded, who was, in fact, dying, as I learned later, was speaking by walkie-talkie to his regimental commander. The glorious 5th Marines have gone through, sir, he was saying, and have achieved the objective. We are now in contact with the 1st Regiment. Now, there's 10 guys in there. And finally, one of the captains speaks up. How many men here from the 1st Marines, he asked. We raised our hands. 6, eh? That ought to be enough. We better take that blockhouse over there. That's where all the machine gun fire seems to be coming from. As soon as this shell fire stops, we'll move out against it. Just like that. The blockhouse had resisted even naval gunfire. It had taken bombs point blank and remained standing. It was obviously covered by a maze of pillboxes. We, 6 of us, were to take it. The captain might be stupid, but no one could say that he was not gallant. I felt disgusted and resigned myself to an unprofitable death. I looked at the men from the 5th, who were regarding us with wonder, and envied them for having retained diplomatic relations with the state of sanity. Their commander was hardly conscious now, but he had heard. He waved a hand weakly in our direction and grinned as though to say, "You'll never make it, but there's no harm in trying." And of course, to a dying man, I suppose there was no harm. So, do you think they're going to do it? Yep, they're going to do it. They're going to charge this blockhouse, 6 guys, this blockhouse. This is just concrete blockhouse, massive machine gun fire coming from it. They're going to charge this thing.
That took bombs straight up.
That took direct hits from bombs.
Crazy.
They make a run for it. Back to the book. The shells drove us back to our crater. Once again, walkie-talkie had difficulty with the apparatus. He could receive but not send. Battalion was asking for positions. "You better report back to command post," Captain said to me. "But come back out." So, Leckie wants to go tell command post what's going on. You can imagine. There's just machine gun fire, mortars going off everywhere. He runs back. He gets back to the major at the command post. "How is it out there, Leckie?" the major asked. "Bad, sir," I said, adding nothing, for my notion of this battle was still a confused jumble of men and movement and explosions in which a blistering hot airfield was somehow involved. Then I arose and said, "I better get back out." The major nodded and waved. "Good luck." I took firm hold of my Tommy gun and adjusted my pack, secured my map case, and circled a pile of shell casings to return to the shell crater. It was my last warlike act. For the last time, I set my face toward the enemy. About 100 yards out, a shell exploded in front of me. I veered to the right. Another shell exploded in front of me. I veered more. Another shell. Another, but closer. 4 more. Another, closer still. I halted. A horrifying fact became clear. I had inserted myself between the enemy artillery and their target. They were hunting something, perhaps the ammunition dump behind me, and were walking their fire in its direction. There was no cover. To go forward was to die. I could only run away from this approaching death, hoping to get out of the target area before it caught me. I turned and ran. I ran with the heat shimmering in waves from the coral, with the sweat oiling my joints and the fear drying my mouth, with the shells exploding behind me, closer, ever closer, the air filled with the angry voices of shrapnel demanding my life. I ran with an image in my mind of the Japanese gunner atop his ridge, bringing each burst carefully closer to my flying rear, chasing me across that baking table in a monstrous game of cat and mouse, gleeful at each greater burst of speed called forth by a closer explosion, and then, tiring of sport, lifting the gun and dropping one before me. A shell landed alongside me, perhaps 5 feet away, but it did not explode, or at least I do not think it did. One cannot be certain at such time. There is a different space and time with fear. But there was a shell, a 2-foot blob of burning red, which struck the coral with a thunderclap and seemed to glance off into the air and go wailing away into the bay. With that, I called upon my remaining strength, and also then the Japanese gunner hit his target. The ammunition dump was hit. The war ended for me. I had been shattered, no good, a dry husk. Modern war had had me. A giant lemon squeezer had crushed me dry. Concussion, heat, thirst, tension, all had their way with me. I must have stumbled about, unable to speak, until at last I sank my knees beside 2 men scratching a foxhole in the sand. They were startled, as though from afar I could hear them discussing me. "He can't think. What do you think's the matter with him? Search me. He don't look wounded. Maybe he got a near miss. Hey fella, what's wrong with you? Can't you say something?" "What do you think we ought to do with him?" They rose and pulled me erect, got a shoulder apiece beneath my armpits, and dragged me like a dummy through the sand. Like a life-size doll in whom the spring had been broken, they dragged me to the doctor. A corpsman laid me on the blanket, tied a ticket to me. He thrust a needle into my arm, which was attached a running hose to a bottle of liquid suspended upside down on a wire frame. The pair who had brought me crouched beside me. "What's wrong with him, Doc?" one of them asked. "I don't know," the corpsman answered. "He's pretty beat up, though. Blast concussion. I'm sending him back to the hospital ship." One of the pair looked longingly at the Tommy gun beside me. His glance seemed to say, "You won't need that anymore." I told him with my eyes to take it, and he slung it over his shoulder with immense satisfaction. Then they left. They had their reward. Mortars were falling as they carried me onto the beach with about a half a dozen other casualties. We lay there, and I wondered dully if the Jap gunners were to catch me after all. At last a landing boat took us aboard and roared off for the ship. I began to feel shame. The others were badly wounded, some put out of pain by morphine, and here I lay in a corner, quietly retching like a frightened kitten, intact, my face unblemished, my bones unbroken. The war was ending. I was ashamed. My spirit crept away from the staring eyes that fastened upon us as the boat was drawn up out of the water to the deck. People in white coats thronged the rail, and 2 of these at the center gazed with authority into the boat, searching for the wounded most in need of aid. I shrank from that expert stare when suddenly one of them pointed at me and said, "Him! Get him downstairs right away." They grasped me, stripping me naked as they did, and hurried me down a ladder, laying me on a table, and again thrusting a needle into my arm. With the liquid flowing into my body came the warm flood of returning self-respect. The dull, dispiriting shame had disappeared the moment that pointing finger singled me out. I had been hurt. I was in need of aid. With a healing power of which he had no inkling, the doctor had restored my spirit to me. So the war ended for me. Each day for a week I ascended the ladder to the deck and gazed in morbid fascination at Peleliu a mile or so away. They were still fighting. One could hear the sound of the firing. Each day the news was bad. We were winning, but at a fearful price.